This one I thought would be interesting, and I will get to Can't Ration My Love. I've got a few videos here, though, in between and all that. Canonical endings he's talking about. And, like, I just picked... I've got 3 videos, one we just watched and 2 others, this one and another one, for a couple of topics that could be interesting.
Hi, everyone.
Interesting.
Tim. Today I want to talk about canonical endings. And by canonical endings, I mean the ending of a game that is considered to be the right ending, or the correct ending, or the true ending, or at the very minimum, the ending the developer expected you to have.
See, that's something as well. Lord of the Rings is not as popular as it used to be, and Warhammer, if anything, is more popular than it used to be, and so you start to get the scales tipped on what people know more of. Even though it's so surprising that I'm like, someone suddenly mentions Warhammer, and I'm like, bro, I didn't even know you were into that. Yeah, that's a thing too. And I don't know if there's a general cultural thing that comes up, but yeah. Because Tolkien's not in the general popular culture as much now. The Hobbit movies came out, people go, well, they sucked, I'm not interested. And then it's like someone like me, I go, well, I'll read the original Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, but I don't have too much interest in all the wider stuff. Like, I read the Silmarillion once. There's so much that I just go, well, I probably don't want to read it again. Yeah. See, there's no problems. There's no drama, so people don't talk about it. Anyway, canonical endings.
Now, for non-linear role-playing games, there's only one ending. Everybody has the exact same experience, and then experiences the one ending that there is, and that's the canonical ending. But for a lot of my games, which were non-linear, multiple ending, very choice and consequence-based games, finding the canonical...
See, Rings of Power coming up garnered more drama on the internet. And then, what now? I don't see people mentioning it.
Story ending can be tough. I know when we were making Fallout, the person who was working on the guide, the play guide, kept asking us, well, what's the player supposed to do? How's this section supposed to be done? And we didn't have an answer.
And no one asked for the Gollum game either, which I've heard is terrible.
For him. We said, well, it really depends on what the player decides to do and what kind of character he's playing and what he happens to choose to do in that moment. So it was hard. If it was hard to write just a walkthrough of the game, you could imagine what they did when they got to the ending and they were like, well, how's it supposed to end?
And yeah, 100%. That was all anyone needed. And there's a separate rant in the, why does everything need more movies, more video games, more stuff? It's like, you can't just have one story like the trilogy of the Lord of the Rings, and The Hobbit is a good thing too. But like, you can't just have the Lord of the Rings and leave it at that. You have to keep going and ruin it. Yeah, but the problem is, I guess they make money off of the name, but then the rest is, nah, you're losing money. Anyway.
Now, the reason you need to come up with a canonical story ending is because if you're making a sequel, you kind of need to have a jumping off place. Now,
so I think of this in the way of Knights of the Old Republic, how there is the canonical endings for like Star Wars games and that, for how the narrative for the whole universe flows and the aftermath of everything that happens there.
Bear in mind, I've only made one sequel so far in my career, and that was Fallout 2. So I'm gonna talk about 4 different ways you can pick a canonical ending or indicate which ending you think is canonical if you're making a sequel. Bear in mind, I've only done this once, so I'm going to start with the one we did for that. So the first
Yeah, or they do a sequel for something that's years and years old, like Ghostbusters. Who expected a sequel for that? They already tried a remake and that fell flat.
First technique is look for the commonalities in all the endings and just assume those commonalities
Yeah.
and nothing else.
I'm going to play Republic Commando later, but I thought while my voice was still okay at the start of stream, I'd react to videos and talk about stuff.
For Fallout 2, that's what we ended up doing. We knew the player had survived, we knew the master and the army had been destroyed, and we knew the player was kicked out of the vault. So, given those elements and nothing else, because a lot of other things could have been very different, what happened to all the different townships, who lived and who didn't, we assumed for Fallout 2 just those three things and then jumped forward. Now, we did assume Tandy had lived because we made her the head of the NCR. So I guess we did one other thing besides that. But when we moved forward, we basically said, let's not reference too many things that the...
Yeah, I think that's pretty good, the way that he's... no. He's talking about it. It's pretty good because he... it's very much what a lot of people have done, like with Knights of the Old Republic 2 and for some other games, is you go off like, there's some bare basic elements that will be consistent, and you reference those. And then you don't need to reference all the other details of what carries on, unless you're going to continue on like you're doing Mass Effect and you want the aftermath of your decisions to be more prominent and that sort of stuff. And then there's still that bit of the common elements are there, but then you don't say that there is a canonical ending to like the first game. And at the moment, how would I pronounce that? Shriek? Edith? Oh yeah, Edith is easier. I'm probably just going to stick to my videos that I have already lined up, because I've got a decent amount here. And then I won't be just reacting to videos all night. It's a collaborative playlist that I've got the link on Discord for adding into things. Yeah. This one is him talking about canonical endings for games. If you missed that.
Just reference things that the player probably... an area the player probably moved through and had some interaction with. So that's one way. You can look at what the commonalities of all the endings are and make that commonality your canonical ending.
Mm-hmm.
Another way you can do it is just to pick one and say, that was the canonical one.
And this is what Star Wars did with Knights of the Old... Oh, Star Wars does with a lot of its games. Knights of the Old Republic, Force Unleashed, Jedi Academy, and that sort of stuff. Or I need to know information, I guess. I hope to see you again in the chat. And, that sort of stuff.
For Arcanum 2, we said, well, we're just going to assume the player defeated Kurgan, and we're going to assume at some point they had learned about Franklin Payne, the great explorer. And then from those two things, we're just going to say, okay, we're going to make Arcanum 2 based on that kind of ending for one. When I was working on Temple of Elemental Evil, and I know I mentioned this before, I had grandiose plans for that. I wanted Temple to move into Against the Giants, the G1, 2, and 3 series, and then I wanted to go into the Descent into the Depths, the D series, and finally Queen of the Demon Web Pits, the Q series, which is now called the ADQ Mega Module. I wanted to do that. So for Temple 2, going into Against the Giants, we were going to assume the good ending for Temple, the one where you went down to the bottom of the temple, encountered Zugmoy, fought her, and banished her. You didn't join her. You didn't let her join you. You didn't become the ultimate evil yourself. We kind of assumed the good ending, where she was banished.
A lot of games do this, I think. That makes sense. Like, by default, Star Wars games have the light side ending as a canonical ending. That gets a bit more debatable and muddy around Star Wars: The Old Republic especially. But all the other Star Wars games, the light side ending is the default ending. And they haven't stated otherwise, so that's pretty cool. Force Unleashed 2 could have gone a different way with that, depending on if what they did with Force Unleashed 3, but we'll never actually know what they were going to do with that.
And that's where we're going to start Temple 2. So that's the second way. Just pick one of your endings and say that's the canonical one. The third way is to let the player pick what ending they want to call the canonical one. You can do this in a lot of ways. You can ask questions about what the player did or would have done had they played through the story, and then base your new sequel storyline based on that. That's what they did for Witcher 3. And that's a really interesting way of doing it. I mean, it lets the player select different things each time they replay the game. And
so what I was thinking of when you mentioned that was like Mass Effect and Dragon Age, where Dragon Age is a bit clunkier to do it with, but you can carry over your decisions from one game to the next.
See how their starting situation would be different. In a way, it's a really cool way of doing end slides, but not until you buy the next game, and not with end slides, that you basically pick the conditions and then boom, that's what the world starts like for you. So I like that. Never did that. Mm-hmm. And then the fourth way of doing canonical endings is to let the player produce a save game from the previous game, and the new game looks at all the tracking variables, because that save game is going to be full of all the tracking variables it's keeping.
Mass Effect did this really well.
For achievements, for end slides, for NPC reaction. And from there, see what the player actually did and base the subsequent game on that. I think the Mass Effects did that, which is a pretty cool way of doing it.
But that also goes back to the Mass Effect games couldn't fully do this because they still had to follow the commonalities of what happened through the story with every single playthrough. So, like, you end up defeating the Reapers. That happens. You're going to end up in Cerberus either way with whatever happens at the start of Mass Effect 2. That sort of stuff. Rather than it being like, what if you just decided not to fight the Reapers? That theoretically could have been an ending in Mass Effect 1.
I've never done that either. So those are all the four ways I can think of doing it, which is, of all your endings, pick the commonalities, or just say one is canonical, or let the player pick one that's canonical, or let the player have his old save game be scanned and you start the sequel based on that.
I would love to see a game that has like a true sequel based completely off of the the Mass Effects work with the smaller details, having the save game tracking, but the overall endings still end up being like the choices at the end of Mass Effect 3. So you end up still just ending up with basing your sequels off of the commonalities as I see it.
I can't think of another way of handling canonical endings, but since I really didn't do a lot of sequels, I didn't really have to think about it. But a lot of people have been asking what I think about canonical endings, and I think that's all my thoughts on the matter. So I hope that answers questions about how I would select the one best right ending to one of my games.
Okay, yeah. So that makes sense. I hadn't pre-watched these, so it's like I don't know exactly what he's gonna say in them. But it makes sense how he frames in the way of like, what would he do? Yeah. And linear games are obviously gonna have like one ending. But like Jedi Academy is quite linear, but you do have like the dark side and light side option. So there is they ended up picking a canonical ending for that too.